So my contribution to the discussion today is part of an ongoing project of tracking what I think of as U.S. militarism. I'm a U.S. citizen, and so that's my primary preoccupation. U.S. militarism's commitments to a closed world and to the marginalization or erasure of the constitutive outsides of the machine that militarism imagines itself to be. And this diagram that you're looking at is this is the diagram of the current U.S. Department of Defense project of Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2. It's emblematic, I think, of this closed world imaginary, and I'm going to come back to it for a closer reading shortly. So my reference to a closed world, as many of you will recognize, is drawn from Paul Edwards' brilliant book of that title, in which he describes the technopolitical imaginary that underwrote the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century, which is now being updated as the US versus China, and sadly again, Russia. And set against this imperial superpower standoff is an anti-colonial imaginary named by anthropologists Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blaser as a world of many worlds. And this follows calls by indigenous leaders, most famously the Zapatista in Chiapas, Mexico, for, in their words, quote, a world where many worlds fit. So we could take these as two aspirational approaches to global security, one based on containment, economic supremacy, and military domination, and the other on negotiated coexistence. So in my current project, I'm interested in following the relevance of closed and open world thinking to questions of US militarism and data. And my starting premise is that data-driven approaches to security, particularly those promoted under the sign of AI, require closed worlds for their operation, and that understanding that requirement can help to clarify militarism's limits. Before I get there, though, let me offer some thoughts about the concept of autonomy. As Jutta and I have discussed in our paper, Human-Machine Autonomies, the concept is a touchstone of liberal humanist understandings of what it means to be self-directed. Based on this definition, the trope of autonomous technology has taken center stage in contemporary technopolitical imaginaries. Thinking about sociotechnical systems and the more than human world, however, suggests that autonomy is a kind of fiction that underwrites onto-epistemologies committed to valorizing individuality and independence and obscuring necessary and constitutive relations. And yet, in a different context, we can think of autonomous zones or autonomous universities as sites that deliberately cut the networks that would otherwise tie them to a dominant political order, precisely to enable more radical and open forms of relationality. So in the face of these frictions, how, as critical analysts, should we proceed? How should we think about this concept? I've suggested the idea of strategic autonomies as a way of underscoring the politics of autonomous systems. And I'm using the qualifier strategic here in the sense of strategic essentialism, a concept developed within feminist and post-colonial theory, most famously by Gayatri Spivak. In the context that Spivak was working, the aim was to find a way to do two somewhat contradictory things at once. The first was to hold on to the premise that identity categories, say the category woman, are not based on any essential features of those they designate. But at the same time, to recognize that those categories have real material consequences, and in the case of woman and other historically oppressed groups, real potential for collective action, by those who identify or are identified as category members. So in the case of identity, strategic essentialism is about adopting in certain contexts an essentialist position in order to be able to intervene and challenge systems of oppression. It involves both recognizing the power of a category or concept in terms of the work that it's done historically and that it continues to do, while also recognizing its indeterminacy. So I think this is helpful with respect to the question of autonomy. Thinking about the concept of autonomy in this way encourages us to focus less on trying to fix a definition and more on tracking how the concept is mobilized, by whom, and with what political effects. So to make this more concrete with respect to sociotechnical systems, let me borrow this image, which many of you may recognize from an article in the March 2022 issue of the magazine Arms Control Today by Marina Favaro and Elke Schwartz, who I believe is with us here, titled Human Augmentation and Nuclear Risk. It's the by now familiar scene of a control room, in this case for an operational test launch of a Minuteman III, a U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile designed to hold multiple warheads programmed to strike independent targets. So what questions might we ask regarding the concept of autonomy in relation to this scene? This depends in part on how we delineate the relevant entities. We can see some people in the photograph, assumed as humans to be in important respects autonomous subjects. Yet they're also in identical uniforms, part of a flight test squadron trained to act collectively and within the disciplinary regimes of a military hierarchy. As Favaro and Schwartz point out, as operators, they are also imagined as functional elements of a technological system, designed in this case to preemptively defend the US homeland. The technological system can be delineated at multiple scales, depending on how we cut the network writ large. And if we cut it broadly, this scene shows one component of the infrastructures of global militarism. So where we locate autonomy in this scene depends, in other words, on how we designate the boundaries of the relevant entities. The humans might be figured alternately as responsible for their own judgments, decisions, and actions, or as functional elements of a larger system. The system might be analyzed through a frame of automation, focused on the many places within it where operations have been algorithmically encoded to run on pre-specified inputs. On the big screen are the ICBMs themselves, which could be said to have some autonomy in their ability to lock on to their designated targets. For those of us attuned to critical studies of science and technology, the scene points to complex relations between automation and autonomy, with all of the associated erasures of labor, of design, of maintenance, of effective operation, and the specific socio-material practices in and through which so-called automated or autonomous systems are enacted in situ. Here's one more photo from the same article, in which technological imaginaries of increasingly automated human-machine configurations, the so-called human augmentation that's the focus of the article, are evident, demonstrating the aspiration of the US military to incorporate its members ever more intimately into the machinery of warfighting. The issues here for me turn less on the prospect that these aspirations will be realized. There are enormous gaps between the fantasies of the technophilic military discourse and the actual states of art of the associated technologies. So it's less a concern that they'll be realized than a focus on what they tell us about the resilience of the closed world imaginaries of command and control that continue to sustain and to expand US militarism. Those imaginaries can be traced back, in the US case, to operations in Vietnam, articulated in 1969 by General William Westmoreland, then Chief of Staff of the US Army, who offered these thoughts over lunch. Quote, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence evaluation, and automated fire control. I see battlefields on which we can destroy anything we locate through instant communications and the almost instantaneous application of highly lethal firepower. With cooperative effort, no more than 10 years should separate us from the automated battlefield." And I think it's really interesting to focus on the somewhat obsessive repetition of the word instantaneous, this temporality, which is so central to this imaginary. So while the US effort to implement this fantasy in Vietnam, Operation Igloo White, was an infamous failure, the fantasy lives on, with the holy grail of data-driven omniscience and weapon systems automation at its beating heart. And Operation Igloo White was an attempt to instrument the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam, the division between North and South Vietnam. And as I say, it was a failure. As this powerful statement from a coalition of peace movements and research institutes in Germany makes clear, there's a through line from Westmoreland's vision to the dream of computer control over nuclear weapon systems during the Cold War, the period that Paul Edwards writes about in The Closed World, to the unmanning of Air Force and the initiation of remotely controlled targeted assassination during the so-called War on Terror, to current investments in data-driven warfighting and so-called all-domain command and control. Each of these rounds of technomilitarism perpetuates the myth that war can be rationalized, and by implication made more precise, and by further implication made more humane, through the expansion of infrastructures of surveillance, the pseudo-objectivity enabled by datafication, and the automation of data analysis and targeting. Orit Halpern summarizes this imaginary in her book Beautiful Data as the, quote, aspiration for the perfect and unadulterated transmission of information as control of the future within a self-referential and contained space. This closed world of data-driven warfighting aims to materialize what Michel Foucault characterized as the 17th century dream of, quote, a sign system that linked all knowledge to a language and sought to replace all languages with a system of artificial symbols and operations of a logical nature. Conjoining sociotechnologies of mapping, surveillance, categorization, and enumeration, military intelligence rests on an infrastructure of data platforms whose interfaces promise privileged access to warfighting's world. In a self-referential cybernetic loop, this technopolitical imaginary enacts a world in which that which escapes datafication no longer counts. The current instantiation of the Foucauldian sign system has its roots in mid-20th century information processing psychology. This conceptualization of military cognition, a diagram equally translatable to persons or systems, has been institutionalized as the canonical observe, orient, decide, and act, or OODA loop, first set out in the mid-1990s by U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd in a series of DoD briefing papers. Most relevant for my analysis is not so much the figure as the white space in which it appears, a problem that I'll come back to shortly. The model is elaborated in a recent rereading of Boyd by his associate Chet Richards. Richards emphasizes that despite the common depiction, Boyd never actually figured his conception of the loop as a sequential or circular course of action. In a much more cybernetic model, Boyd rediagrams the OODA loop as shown here and offers this reading focused on the critical phases of observation and orientation. And I hope you can see this well enough to see the labels above the various sections of the diagram. So he writes, the entire orientation bubble, that's the second box over from the left, the entire orientation bubble, including the blocks and all the interactions between them, represents our mental models of reality that are making predictions about the effects of our actions. The observation bubble includes, and that's the one on the left, includes all the ways we bring in information from the external world, as well as about our own bodies and minds. Datafication then on this model requires the translation of those arrowed objects that are labeled on the left, unfolding circumstances, outside information, and unfolding interaction with environment, translating those into computationally legible signals that will control the conduct of war. And again, the bounded units of the diagram's bubbles and the white space in which it floats at once presume and also artfully dodge the question of relations between the figure and its ground, the insides of the machine and its constitutive outsides. Since the 1990s, the OODA sequence has continued to serve as a normative model of what in common military parlance is called situational awareness, promoted most industriously by Mika Ensley, former chief scientist of the United States Air Force. Situational awareness is defined by Ensley as, quote, the perception of environmental elements and events with respect to time or space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their future states. A connecting thread across these cybernetic models is an objectivist onto epistemology that's well suited, I think, to the elision of signals, data, and information. The white space is the world out there that presents itself to military agents who act. There's a presumption that relevant entities and events will be detectable to various sensors. The problems that arise are framed in terms of insufficiencies in the number of sensors, the number of signals, the amount of data available, along with insufficiencies in the speed of its transmission and processing, rather than anything more fundamental about how military knowledge systems make their worlds. Which brings us back to this figure, figure 1 from the DoD's summary of the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, or JADC2 initiative, released in March of 2022. The figure, titled in a somewhat homely spirit, the JADC2 placemat, was characterized by analysts from the Hudson Institute, a conservative think tank, as, quote, a graphic that was confusing even by Defense Department standards. Confusing, perhaps, but also, I think, illuminating. So let's read it through a kind of closed world imaginary. So we can start with the center panel, which you might recognize as the familiar OODA loop, operating again here as a cognitivist reduction of warring bodies to a kind of black box that enacts decision, taking input received through its sensors, processing that input, and then producing output in the form of action. And each step in this cycle of decision is then expanded into its associated components. So we can start with, on the left, the what that sources the input. That's originating as data. You can see it kind of streaming in from the diagram's frame, beyond outside the diagram's frame on the left. And then it's channeled into a set of stacks, which is the general architecture of computing. And in this case, the stacks correspond to the current sorting of warfighting into domains. So we have air, land, sea, space, and cyber, which together comprise a set of interlocking and interoperable systems. There's the kind of jigsaw rendering of that. These input sources are then funneled through the structuring filters of quotes, attributes, architectures, and interfaces to make the results of the data gathering apparatus accessible to decision. Or more accurately, to make them accessible to the further machinery that's designed to make sense of the data through the intercessions of floating up above here, predictive analytics, machine learning, and the residual signifier AI. And the aim of all this data processing is, of course, the generation of output to be implemented by, quotes, people, processes, and authorities, comprising the enactment of the JADC2 vision that then joins together, moving to the right, the 11 combat commands to manage the state actors on the right, whose positioning as threats provides the justifying grounds for the whole machinery. And then floating somewhat ambiguously below, kind of between all of this, is the warfighting network, which is figured as a kind of cross between the iconic tank and the aspirational cloud. And everything is then all joined together by these dotted lines of electronic transmission. And then finally, hovering along the bottom of the frame is the repository of doctrine. And at the top, the program's aim, that is, quote, the warfighting capability to sense, make sense, and act at all levels and phases of war across all domains and with partners to deliver information advantage at the speed of relevance. Speed of relevance, which is an interesting construct. So the pursuit of this vision has seen over the past 5 to 10 years a building out of infrastructures of surveillance that have now outpaced the capacities of data analysis. And this is where the magical thinking of AI-enabled warfighting enters the picture. In April of 2017, the DoD announced plans for its flagship AI project, the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, codenamed Project Maven, and accompanied by this, I think, quite extraordinary logo. I'm afraid I can't do a reading of that for you because I find it totally perplexing. The announcement of Project Maven by then Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work asserted the urgent need to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning across DoD operations. Project Maven's aim, more specifically, Work states in this memorandum, is, quote, to turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD into actionable intelligence and insights at speed. The plan, as Work sets it out, includes an initial project focusing on the task of labeling data within full motion video images generated by U.S. drone surveillance operations as a first step toward establishing the algorithms and computational infrastructures needed to automate, quote, object detection, classification, and alerts in support of military operations. These are then the Marshall epistemologies that are detailed by Eric Reichborn-Kennerud in his book, Worlds of Military Targeting, coming out soon, what he names as, quote, technologies for the production of the enemy. The media reports surrounding Project Maven overwhelmingly have begged the question of just what its objects are and the criteria by which objects are identified as imminent threats. We're told that 38 categories were used by those who hand-labeled 150,000 images to form the initial training data, including the object, quote, an ISIS pickup truck. This raises the question of the presumed self-evidence of objects and the relation between systems for the categorization of decontextualized images of objects, in this case, a truck, and the question of how objects are incorporated into complex and changing relations and associated practices, the open world that my title refers to. As Shamayo pointed out a decade ago in his theory of the drone, claims for precision that justify new investments in automated targeting systems are based on a systematic conflation of the relation between a weapon and its designated target on the one hand, and the identification of what constitutes a legitimate target on the other. So no amount of improvement in the technologies of the first can address the growing uncertainties of the second. And insisting that they can is part of a campaign to deny the increasing reliance of the US and allied militaries on ever more questionable forms of stereotypic categorization of what and who constitutes an imminent threat and a legitimate target. The work of challenging this is being done by a growing coalition of researchers and investigative journalists. And to take just one indicative example, critical international relations scholars Perugini and Gordon consider the generative effects of military investments in a machinery of situational awareness based on the subjection of big data to algorithmic analysis. And they write, quote, following Foucault's notion of dispositif, we understand these new technologies and epistemic operations as part of an apparatus of distinction, which denotes an array of interrelated forces that frame, shape, produce, construe, and thus give meaning to the relationship among the actors within the battle space. The horrors of this apparatus have become clear with the reported application of machine learning to targeting by the IDF in Israel's ongoing assault in Gaza, following the Hamas massacre and kidnapping of Israelis on October 7th. And I know that Mari spoke about this in the pre-conference workshop, and many of you will have followed these reports. So in a series of investigative reports published in the Israeli-Palestinian outlets Plus 972 and Local Call, Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham has given us detailed accounts of two of the IDF's current systems, named respectively Hapsora, or the Gospel, and Lavender. The first report, published last November, draws on sources within the Israeli intelligence community who confirm that IDF operations in the Gaza Strip combine more permissive authorization for the bombing of non-military targets with a loosening of constraints regarding expected civilian casualties. So this policy sanctions the bombing of built structures in densely populated civilian areas, arguably against international humanitarian law, including high-rise residential and public buildings designated as so-called power targets. Official legal guidelines require that selected buildings must house a legitimate military target and must be empty at the time of their destruction. And of course, the latter has resulted in the IDF's issuance of a constant and changing succession of increasingly unfeasible evacuation orders to those who are trapped in diminishingly small areas of Gaza. Moreover, once Israel has declared the entire surface of Gaza as a cover for Hamas tunnels, all of which are assumed to be legitimate military targets, the entire strip has become fair game for destruction. A direct corollary of this operational strategy is the need for an unbroken stream of candidate targets. To meet this requirement, Hapsora is designed to accelerate the generation of targets from surveillance data, creating what one former intelligence officer who's quoted in the story's headline describes as a mass assassination factory. The second story, published in April, describes the system named Lavender, dedicated to the targeting now of individuals designated as suspected low-level Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants. The training data were based on features correlated with known Hamas or PIJ fighters, including people who are in a WhatsApp group with an identified militant, people who get new cell phones every few months, or people who change their addresses frequently. Clearly, at the moment, a characterization of everyone in Gaza. All individuals in the population data set, which is built from the massive surveillance infrastructure of the occupied territories, are then assigned a score from 1 to 100. And based on these scores and the setting of thresholds within that range of numbers, the system in the early days of the assault on Gaza marked some 37,000 people as probable militants and potential targets. The machine-generated targets were given only cursory review, so one source explained that he would spend roughly 20 seconds to confirm that an individual was male, given an understanding of the prohibition within Hamas and PIJ against women fighters. And Abraham further describes a kind of horrendous cost-benefit calculus that plots the monetary value and availability of bombs against the rating of the target, resulting in the use of so-called dumb bombs against those categorized as low-level militants. So a quote from the article, quote, "You don't want to waste expensive bombs on unimportant people. It's very expensive for the country, and there's a shortage of those bombs." So this is one of the intelligence officers interviewed by Abraham. And moreover, to simplify the labor of tracking targets on the move, individuals are attacked when they return to their homes at night, with the result that entire families are killed along with the target, another clear violation of IHL. Most notably, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza has shifted the argument for AI-enabled targeting from claims to greater precision and accuracy to the objective of accelerating the rate of destruction. IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has confirmed that in the bombing of Gaza, quote, "the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy." For those who have been advancing precision and accuracy as the high moral ground of data-driven targeting, this admission must surely be disruptive. It shifts the narrative from a technology in aid of adherence to international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, to automation in the name of industrial scale productivity in target generation, enabling greater speed and efficiency in killing. As the intelligence sources acknowledge, moreover, Israel's operations are not indiscriminate, but are deliberately designed to create shock among the civilian population under the premise that this will somehow contribute to Israel's aim of eliminating Hamas. Based on the evidence from Gaza, where as of now, civilian casualties have surpassed 35,000, are likely significantly higher, including over 14,000 children, the gospel of AI-enabled precision and accuracy has now been revealed as a pretext for the acceleration of unrestrained and criminal acts of mass killing and destruction. And of course, all of this occurs in the context of Israel's economic commitment to establishing itself as a leading purveyor of high-tech military technoscience, not least in so-called AI-enabled warfighting. And I should say, and I should have said at the beginning, that my engagement with this is from the position of a Jewish American who feels doubly implicated in these operations. So let me bring things to a close. In her brilliant book, Cloud Ethics, Louisa Moore writes, quote, "When machine learning algorithms segment a social scene, generating clusters of data with similar propensities, everything must be attributed. Yet that which is unattributable does remain within the scene, exceeding the algorithm's ability to show and tell, as well as opening onto a different kind of community and a different mode of being together, of being ethico-political." Moore describes what she calls the geographies of locatability and rules of association that enable algorithmic intensification and automated decision. Across a range of examples, she argues, quote, "the decisions taken on the back of algorithmic calculations conceal political difficulty, even discrimination and violence, within an apparently neutral and glossy technoscience. The question then is how to open up these contingencies and ambiguities in order to politicize what would otherwise be a highly technologized set of moves." And I think it's worth returning in this regard to the words of Langdon Winner in his book Autonomous Technology, published in 1977. He writes, quote, "Shielded by the conviction that technology is neutral and tool-like, a whole new order is built, piecemeal, step by step, with the parts and pieces linked together in novel ways, without the slightest public awareness or opportunity to dispute the character of the changes underway. It is somnambulism, that is, sleepwalking, rather than determinism, that characterizes technological politics." In the case of modern militarism, waking up from that sleepwalk means following the shifting agencies involved in the automation of military systems and their implications for legality, accountability, and impunity. It means working to challenge military logics and expose the ways in which they fail in practice to constitute the intelligibility that is their justifying foundation. With respect to autonomous systems, we need to do this work with an awareness that autonomy is itself a useful fiction, an always contingent, rhetorically charged attribution in which entity boundaries are drawn and responsibility is variously embraced or evaded. Autonomy is never an innocent concept, in other words, and it needs to be accountable for its own rhetorical agencies and material consequences. Our responsibility as scholars is to trace those rhetorics and consequences and to hold those invested in projects of machine autonomy, particularly those that obscure the ubiquitous presence of human hands, to hold those projects to account. Thanks. That's it.